"Grandma, you lied." That's what he said, in the small kitchen where I'd spent half my life stirring soup, brewing coffee, and waiting for someone to come home. He said it so softly, I almost thought he was quoting something from school, a line from a play or a film. But then I looked up and saw the way his hands shook, the way he kept his gaze fixed on the floor, as though looking at me might make the words less true. My name is Eleanor. I'm 78 years old. I live alone in a house that smells faintly of salt and lemon polish, a house that once echoed with the sound of a boy's laughter and the faint ticking of a clock that hasn't kept proper time since the year my daughter left. For 16 years, I've been grandmother, mother, nurse, disciplinarian, and bedtime storyteller to the same child, the only child I had left to love. And in one breath, in one sentence, he turned the ground beneath me to sand. It was Saturday morning. The fog had only just begun to lift from the coast, leaving behind thin trails of silver moisture on the window panes. I was shelling peas for soup, my fingers slow but practiced, and Leo sat at the table with his phone beside him, unread messages lighting up like insects trapped under glass. He looked older that morning, maybe because he'd started shaving, or maybe because he'd come carrying something heavier than his age could bear. When he said those 3 words, I heard not anger, but grief, the kind that comes from discovering the world isn't as simple as the adults promised. He said it again, clearer this time, his voice cracking at the edges. "Grandma, you lied." And then, before I could breathe, he reached into his backpack and laid an envelope on the table between us. It was creased, smudged, the kind of letter that had traveled through too many hands. On the front, my name, written in blue ink I hadn't seen in more than a decade. Clara's handwriting, my daughter's. For a long moment, the only sound was the kettle hissing softly on the stove. I thought of the last time I'd seen that handwriting, court documents, therapy forms, promises signed and broken in the same gesture. My mouth went dry. I didn't ask who gave him the letter. I didn't have to. I could see it in his trembling. Someone had told him a story, and for the first time, it wasn't mine. He looked at me like a stranger he'd once trusted, like a teacher caught cheating on an exam. I tried to speak, but the words tangled inside me. All I managed was his name, barely audible. He didn't look up. When he pushed the envelope toward me, I could smell the faint trace of perfume clinging to the paper, cheap, floral, and heartbreakingly familiar. I thought I had forgotten that scent, the one she used to drown herself in before job interviews, before dates, before disappointments. It was the scent of her hope, the thing I'd buried along with the rest of her memory when she disappeared. I ran my thumb over the flap, but didn't open it. Not yet. "She found me online," he said, still staring at the table. "She said you never told me the truth." He paused, swallowing. "She said you kept me from her." The room tilted. My heart didn't race, it sank. I had prepared for many possible confrontations in my life. Neighbors asking about the past, social workers reevaluating old files, even the silent judgment of people who thought they knew what kind of woman keeps her own daughter's child. But not this. Not Leo, with his cautious kindness, with the face that used to rest against my arm as he fell asleep. The child who once asked if heaven had bedtime stories. I wanted to tell him that lies are sometimes built from love, that truth can bruise more than it heals. But I knew that kind of talk would only sound like more deceit. Instead, I sat down slowly, as though gravity had doubled. "She wrote to you," I said, and he nodded. "When?" "A month ago," he said. She said she tried before, but you always stopped her. She said you told people she was dead." I almost laughed. It was such a cruel exaggeration of what had happened that it felt theatrical. But then I saw his eyes, wet but steady, searching for the woman he'd believed I was. I reached across the table, but he leaned back. The rejection was small, instinctive, yet it carved something out of me I didn't know was still there. I wanted to tell him the whole story, to unravel 16 years of silence in one breath, to show him the files and the reports and the late-night phone calls that ended in sirens. I wanted to explain that I didn't steal him. I rescued him. That Clara had been a danger to herself. That the court had begged me to take custody because no one else would. That love sometimes means becoming the villain in someone else's story. But explanations don't sound like truth to someone whose loyalty has just shifted. I knew that. So I said nothing. He waited, maybe hoping I would deny it all, and when I didn't, something in his shoulders tightened. "I just wanted to know if it's true," he said. "If you lied." I should have said no. I should have said I did what I had to. Instead, I said the only thing I could manage. "I don't know what's true anymore." He stood then, slowly, like an old man inside a young boy's body. He left the letter on the table. The door closed behind him with a gentleness that hurt more than slamming would have. I sat there a long time, listening to the kettle whistle until it went quiet. Outside, the gulls cried over the sound of the tide coming in, and I thought about the last time I saw Clara. Her thin arms crossed over a borrowed coat. The words you took everything trembling on her lips. That was 16 years ago. I never expected her to stay gone forever, but I didn't expect her to return this way either, through ink and accusation, through a boy who carried both our faces in his reflection. When I finally opened the letter, the first line was simple. "My dear Leo, you deserve to know the truth." And though the rest of the words blurred in my vision, that first sentence was enough to make my hands shake. The truth. Everyone thinks they want it until it arrives like a storm in the middle of their calm life, tearing through the walls they built from good intentions. I folded the letter back carefully, as if handling evidence from a crime scene. Maybe it was. Maybe love can become a kind of crime when it outlives its permission. I placed the letter beside the cooling peas and stared out the window at the sea. The tide had already erased the footprints from this morning's walk, smooth and indifferent. It struck me that I had spent so much of my life trying to protect one child from another's mistakes that I'd forgotten how little control anyone truly has over what people remember. Clara would have her version, Leo his, and I was left with the spaces in between, the quiet rooms of memory where the truth refuses to stay in one piece. When night came, I didn't cook. I didn't turn on the television. I sat in the dark with the letter open on my lap and let the house creak around me. Somewhere down the road, a foghorn sounded, long and low, like a warning. I whispered to the air, to no one in particular. I didn't lie, not the way you think. I just told the story that kept him safe. But the room gave no answer, only the distant hum of the sea and the faint smell of burnt peas. It was then I realized that whatever happened next would not be about defense or proof. It would be about endurance, about how a woman keeps standing after the child she raised calls her a liar, about how truth, once unburied, doesn't set you free. It just asks what kind of cage you want to live in now. The letter stayed on my kitchen table for 2 days before I could bring myself to read it again. I moved it from one corner to another as if it were just clutter, a misplaced bill or an old recipe card, but it seemed to follow me around the house, humming under the surface of everything I did. Even when I swept the porch or watered the geraniums, I could feel its presence waiting for me, patient and poisonous. On the third morning, I sat down with my coffee and unfolded it carefully, afraid that the paper might crumble under my fingers. The handwriting was unmistakable. Clara's long, careless loops, the same hand that used to sign notes for school absences with a flourish, the same that scrawled angry apologies on napkins during the years when she still came home between disasters. It began with a sweetness I didn't trust. My dear Leo. And then the words turned sharp, deliberate. You deserve to know why I wasn't there. Your grandmother made sure of it. She told the court I was unstable. She said I was dangerous. She told everyone I left you. But I didn't. She took you from me and lied about who I was. I read it twice. The first time as a mother, the second as a woman who had survived her own child's storms. The letter was clever. It mixed just enough truth with invention to sound believable. Yes, there had been hearings. Yes, I had begged the judge not to send Leo back to a woman who was still shaking from withdrawal, still bringing strangers home, still missing nights she couldn't account for. But I hadn't stolen him. I had stepped in because no one else would. Yet on paper it looked so simple, so damning. Every line carried a tone of injured dignity, the kind people believe because they want to believe in redemption more than they believe in consequences. She wrote, I was getting better. Mom never forgave me for trying to live without her. That was the part that twisted the knife. Because maybe she was right about that. I never forgave her, not for leaving the boy, but for leaving herself behind. That evening, Leo came home late from school. He looked different, somehow older and smaller at the same time, like someone who'd seen too much too quickly. He didn't greet me the way he used to. He went straight to his room, door half closed, the hum of his computer filling the silence between us. I wanted to knock, to tell him the version of the truth that might still fit in his heart. But I stopped myself. The moment I reached for that doorknob, I realized I no longer had the right. It was a strange kind of grief, losing someone who was still in the house. I went back to the kitchen, poured another cup of coffee I didn't need, and stared at the empty chair across from me. There was a time when he would sit there, talking about school projects and silly crushes and the new songs he wanted me to hear. Now, all that warmth had condensed into a single accusation. You lied. Later that night, I found him sitting on the porch steps, phone in hand, face lit by the glow of the screen. I asked if he'd eaten. He said yes, though the untouched plate in the sink told another story. Then he asked, without looking at me, "Why didn't you tell me she was alive?" The question came out quiet, but it split the air open. I told him I thought it was better that way, that she had chosen to disappear, that I didn't want him to wait by windows the way I once did. He said, "You decided that for me." And he was right. I had. The truth, once spoken aloud, sounded less like protection and more like possession. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He just nodded slowly, as if a verdict had been reached, and went back inside. I stayed outside long after he closed his door, listening to the sea breaking in the distance, thinking about all the ways love can sound like control when spoken from the wrong mouth. The next morning, a call came from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer. It was a woman's voice, young but rehearsed. She said she was calling on behalf of Clara. She wanted to confirm an address. She'd like to send something else for Leo, she said. I asked where she was calling from, but the line clicked dead before I got an answer. For a few seconds, I just stood there, phone still against my ear, hearing nothing but the faint echo of my own breath. I told myself it was some friend of hers or a caseworker or maybe another attempt to provoke me. But I knew that voice. I had heard it once before, years ago, in a clinic hallway. The counselor who had told me, "Sometimes love becomes a leash." I hadn't understood her then. I did now. By afternoon, Leo was gone. He'd left a note on his desk. "I'm going to meet her. Don't worry." The neatness of his handwriting undid me. It was so careful, so considerate, as if he was still the polite boy who used to thank me for dinner. But the sentence was final. My hands shook as I read it again and again. There were no details, no address, no way to follow him without proving every awful thing his mother might have said about me. For the first time in 16 years, the house was silent in a way that wasn't peaceful. Every room echoed with questions I couldn't ask. I sat at the table, the same place where this all began, and stared at the clock. It had stopped again, the second hand trembling just before the 12, as if even time was holding its breath. That night I didn't sleep. I tried to imagine what she looked like now. The last time I saw Clara, she was 29, her face a battlefield between beauty and exhaustion. I had stood in the doorway of her apartment, begging her to come with me, and she had laughed, one of those hollow laughs that sounded borrowed. "You just want to own me," she said. Maybe I did. Maybe I wanted to own the part of her that wasn't broken yet, to save it before the world swallowed it whole. And now, after all these years, she had reached across that distance with a letter that made me the monster. Maybe she needed to. Maybe that was the only way she could forgive herself. But forgiveness built on blame is like a house built on sand. Sooner or later, it sinks and takes everyone with it. The next morning, I found myself standing at the edge of the water, still in my nightgown, watching the waves collapse into each other. The horizon was pale, colorless, the way it gets before rain. I thought about how everything in my life had been shaped by silence. The silence of the courtroom, the silence of the nights waiting for news, the silence of a child too young to understand why his mother didn't come back. And now this silence again, heavy and familiar, except this time, it was mine alone. The letter had done what years of distance couldn't. It brought us all back into the same story. Only now I was the villain, and Clara was the ghost who'd learned to write. I wanted to burn the pages, to let the sea take them, but I folded the letter instead and slipped it into my coat pocket. Some truths, once written, demand witnesses. When I walked back home, the house felt smaller, the walls closer. The photo of Leo as a toddler, chubby cheeks, chocolate on his chin, seemed to watch me with quiet reproach. I took it down, not because I was ashamed, but because I couldn't bear his eyes on me. For the first time since Clara disappeared, I wondered if I should have told him everything from the start, every failure, every lie, every night spent on the phone with the police, asking if they'd found her. But I didn't want to give him that kind of inheritance. I wanted him to grow up believing in steadiness, in safety. Now I realized that safety is just another word for ignorance when the truth finally arrives. And it always arrives. Sometimes in a letter. Sometimes in the voice of the child you thought you'd protected. Sometimes in the silence that follows when he walks out the door and doesn't look back. That was the day I stopped pretending the past was finished. It wasn't. It had only been sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it with 3 simple words. Grandma, you lied. The first 3 days after Leo's disappearance blurred together like watercolor left in the rain. Time lost its edges, and the hours folded over one another without sound or consequence. I woke at dawn because the sea did, because the light forced its way through the curtains whether I wanted it or not. His room remained exactly as he had left it, bed unmade, clothes still half folded on the chair, a faint trace of his cologne in the air that hadn't yet surrendered to the salt wind. I opened the window just enough to hear the gulls, and for a moment I imagined he might walk up the path again, bag slung over his shoulder, full of forgiveness or at least confusion. But the street stayed empty, and the only footsteps belonged to the postman, who left nothing but bills and advertisements, little paper proofs that life was continuing somewhere else. I began talking to myself again, not out of madness, but because silence can become unbearable when no one calls your name. I asked the kettle if it missed him, asked the chair if it still felt his weight, asked God if he ever felt embarrassed by the mess he'd made of mothers and daughters. None of them answered. On the 4th morning, a postcard arrived. No envelope, just an image of a mountain lake printed in cheap color, the kind you find in gas stations. The handwriting was Leo's, neat but uncertain, as if every letter had been negotiated. I'm safe. Don't worry. She's better now. I'll write soon. There was no return address. I turned it over again and again, as if I might shake more words from it. The lake looked still, perfect, unnatural. I tried to remember if Clara had ever been near a lake. Probably not. She was always drawn to cities, to the noise, the heat, the anonymity of places where you could disappear without anyone noticing. Maybe she'd found one again. Maybe she'd dragged him into that noise. I placed the postcard on the mantel and stared at it until the printed water began to shimmer. For a moment I thought I saw my reflection there, but it was only the light. The days that followed were slow and cruel. The neighbors stopped asking how I was after the first polite attempt. They'd seen enough missing faces in their own families to know that grief doesn't want company. I went to the market, bought bread I didn't need, fruit I wouldn't eat, anything that required human interaction. The cashier asked if I wanted the senior discount, and I said no, as if pride could substitute for companionship. At home, I boiled eggs just to have the smell of something living, something changing. Each night, I sat by the window and watched the same streetlights flicker on, one by one, as though testing my patience. I started writing letters I never sent, to Leo, to Clara, to myself. In one of them, I wrote, "You can forgive someone for leaving, but not for taking your silence with them." A week passed before I heard from him again, this time not through mail, but through a voice note that arrived on my phone, that small rectangle I had almost forgotten how to use. His voice was careful, deliberate, too calm. "Grandma, I'm fine. Don't try to find me. Mom's helping me understand things. We just need time. Please don't make it harder." He sounded older, like a boy practicing adulthood. I replayed it so many times the words began to lose meaning, became just rhythm, the way waves repeat themselves, until they stop being sound and turn into memory. He called her Mom. That word, once mine by default, now belonged to someone else. It shouldn't have mattered. I had always known this day might come, but it did. It mattered in a way I couldn't explain to anyone, not even to the empty house that had become both witness and accomplice. That night, I went through the cedar chest again, not for the documents this time, but for the small things that smelled like our former lives. a baby blanket worn thin at the edges, a drawing of a stick figure, family labeled me plus grandma plus Cookie, the cat, a seashell he had found on his first trip to the beach. I held each item like a confession. I wondered what Clara would tell him now, what version of me she was building from the scraps of her pain. Would she tell him I had locked her out, that I had stolen her son, that I had stood in the way of her redemption? Maybe she believed those things. Maybe belief is just another way to survive your own failures. I remembered how she used to write poetry in high school, clumsy, self-important lines about freedom and hunger. Once she had written, "Love is a cage I built myself." At the time, I thought she meant romance. Now I understood she might have meant me. The next morning, I found something strange on the porch. A small envelope with no stamp, slipped under the door sometime during the night. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. "Stop calling the police. He's fine. Let him live his own life." No signature, no handwriting I recognized. I hadn't called the police. I hadn't called anyone. The letter felt like a warning written before the crime. I folded it back and placed it in the drawer beside the first one, the one from Clara. 2 letters now, 2 voices from the same void, and between them, the fragile silence of a boy who no longer belonged to me. For the first time in years, I locked the door before bed. I'd never been afraid of the dark before. It had always been my ally, the space where no one asked for explanations, but now it felt crowded, filled with the ghosts of every decision I had made in the name of love. I dreamed of Clara standing at the foot of my bed, holding Leo by the hand. She said, "You can't have both of us." And when I tried to reach for her, she vanished, leaving only the boy, and then he too dissolved into light. I woke up with my heart pounding, the sound of waves crashing through the open window, though the sea was calm that night. I realized then that dreams aren't lies. They're just the truths we refuse to face while awake. I began writing again, not letters, but a kind of diary. I needed to trap the days somewhere, to prove to myself that I was still living them. I wrote about the weather, about the smell of rain, about the way the seagulls circled the cliffs when a storm was coming. But beneath every line was the same confession. I'm afraid she'll win. Not because of Leo, children grow, they make choices, but because if her story becomes the truth in his eyes, then my life becomes a lie. Everything I built, every sleepless night, every sacrifice turns to ash the moment he believes her version. And that, I think, is the cruelest punishment age gives us. The awareness that history is written not by the survivors, but by those who speak last. 2 weeks passed before I saw his face again, not in person, but in a photograph posted online. A friend of his from school had tagged him in a picture. He was sitting in a cafe, smiling shyly, a woman beside him whose profile I recognized even through the blur of the lens. Clara, older, thinner, hair dyed dark but unmistakable. She looked at him with a mix of pride and fear, the way someone looks at borrowed light. I stared at that photo until my eyes burned. They looked like a family, the way we once did before everything cracked. I should have felt relief. She was alive. He was safe. But all I felt was the slow ache of being replaced. It's a peculiar kind of death, being erased while you're still breathing. I didn't comment on the photo. I didn't call. I simply printed it out on my old printer and pinned it to the corkboard in the hallway, next to the postcard. My little gallery of ghosts. I stood there for a long time, the smell of ink sharp in the air, thinking about how quickly a lifetime can be rewritten. Outside, the evening light turned everything to gold, the kind of beauty that hurts because it doesn't last. I whispered, "Come home, just once more," knowing he wouldn't hear me, and maybe shouldn't. Because some homes can't be returned to. They exist only in the mind of the one who kept them clean. And so I waited. Not for a call, not for forgiveness, but for something smaller and stranger. The moment when the hurt would stop feeling like proof of love and start feeling like freedom. It hadn't come yet, but I could sense it somewhere out there, moving slowly toward me like the tide that always returns, no matter how many times it's pushed away. It was the third week without Leo when I found myself drawn to the cedar chest again, the same one that had survived 2 moves, 1 flood, and every reinvention of my life. I had avoided it after the last time, afraid of what it might force me to remember, but that morning I felt a pull I couldn't name. Perhaps it was the silence of the house, or the dull ache of a body that had been waiting too long for a door to open. The sun was slanting through the blinds in thin, pale lines, carving the room into quiet compartments. I knelt down slowly, the way you do when your bones have started keeping secrets from you, and lifted the lid. The smell of cedar and thyme rose up like a sigh. Inside, everything was as I'd left it. The papers tied with twine, the box of photographs, the cassette tapes from the old answering machine I'd never thrown away, because part of me still believed that the past, when rewound, might sound different. I took one tape out, labeled in my handwriting, March 2010, custody hearing, follow-up. My hands trembled as I placed it into the small tape player, and for a moment I almost stopped myself. But curiosity is a dangerous mercy. It convinces you that knowledge will hurt less than uncertainty. I pressed play. The sound came softly at first. Static, a cough, a woman's voice. My own, younger, steadier. I heard myself speaking to someone, probably the social worker. I said things like she hasn't come home in 4 nights, and the neighbors called again. Then another voice, calm, bureaucratic. "Mrs. Hayworth, do you understand that taking the child means assuming full guardianship?" My recorded self replied, "Yes, I understand. Someone has to keep him safe." There was a pause, and then that same calm voice asked, "And what about your daughter?" I heard a long silence on the tape, and then a whisper so soft I had to rewind it twice to be sure I caught the words. "She's already gone." The tape clicked off, and the silence that followed was worse than any noise. I sat there staring at the player, realizing that the truth of who I had been, afraid, decisive, desperate, was not the villain or the savior, but something in between. I wasn't trying to steal her son. I was trying to salvage what remained of both of them. I spent the rest of the morning going through the old folders, the court notices, the faded photographs where Clara still smiled with her whole face, before the world and her choices hardened it. There was one picture of her holding Leo as a baby, both of them laughing, his tiny hands tangled in her hair. I'd kept it hidden because it hurt too much to look at, but now it felt wrong to keep pretending she had never loved him. She had. She just hadn't known how to stay. The photo trembled in my hand as I placed it on the table, next to the letter she'd sent him. For the first time, I looked at them side by side and thought maybe they weren't contradictions after all. Just 2 halves of the same broken sentence. That afternoon, the wind rose from the sea, shaking the windows until they rattled like loose bones. I made tea, though I didn't drink it, and sat in my chair watching the curtain breathe in and out. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but I realized that I didn't have a single person who truly knew me anymore. Not the woman I'd become in all this waiting. I had friends once, other mothers from the church group, but I'd grown tired of their polite pity. They liked stories that ended neatly, with forgiveness, with family reunions, with redemption that could be photographed and framed. My story was not one of those. Mine was about endurance, about the kind of love that doesn't fit into polite conversation. So I sat alone, with the tape still whispering through my mind. She's already gone. That night, I dreamed of Clara again, but this time she wasn't accusing me. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same one where Leo had said his terrible words. She looked tired, but calm. Her hands folded around a mug of coffee. "You did what you had to," she said, her voice exactly as I remembered it from her gentler days. "You kept him safe." I wanted to believe it was forgiveness, but even in the dream, I knew it wasn't. It was just understanding, and that, in its way, was rarer. I woke with tears on my face, but they weren't bitter. They felt like something being washed clean. When morning came, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I left the house for no reason. I walked into town, not to buy groceries or pay bills, but simply to move. The air smelled of seaweed and rain. People nodded politely as I passed, strangers who had no idea I was a ghost walking among them. I stopped in front of a thrift store I used to visit with Leo when he was little. We'd look for old records and mismatched mugs, laugh at the forgotten lives on display. I hadn't been inside since he turned 12, when he decided it was embarrassing to be seen shopping with me. I went in. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle. The shelves were crowded, the air thick with the scent of dust and fabric softener. I wandered slowly until I found myself standing before a small stack of framed pictures, portraits of people I didn't know, sold for $1 apiece. Families, weddings, school photos, someone else's memories, orphaned from their owners. I bought one, a picture of an elderly woman holding a baby. The faces meant nothing to me, but the gesture did. It was the pose of protection, the posture of every woman who ever believed love alone could shield a child from harm. I carried it home carefully, like a relic. That evening, I placed the photograph on the mantel beside the postcard and the printed photo of Leo with Clara. 3 generations of ghosts, none of them touching, all of them staring in different directions. I sat in my chair and stared back at them, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt something closer to exhaustion, but softer, like surrender, but without defeat. I understood that my power had always been smaller than I thought. I couldn't make Clara stay sober, couldn't make Leo stay loyal, couldn't even make my own heart stop aching. But I could choose how to carry the pain. I could decide whether it would poison me or teach me patience. That, at least, was still mine to command. When the phone rang later that night, I almost didn't answer. I assumed it was another wrong number, but the voice that came through made me sit up straight. "Mrs. Hayworth, this is Officer Daniel from Portland County. We have your grandson here." My throat closed around his name. "He's fine," the officer added quickly. "He just had a bit of a disagreement with his mother. He asked us to call you." I didn't realize I was crying until I heard myself whispering "thank you" over and over. He said Leo was safe at a local shelter, that Clara had left after an argument. that he didn't want to go home with her. My first instinct was to rush out the door, but then I hesitated. I didn't know if going to him would heal or harm. Still, the decision made itself. I packed a small bag, nothing dramatic, just a sweater, my wallet, and the photograph of the woman and the baby. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and whispered to the house, "I'll be back if there's anything left to come back to." The drive to Portland was 3 hours of rain and silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove, my eyes fixed on the road, my mind a slow, steady chant. He's safe. He's safe. When I finally saw the sign for the city limits, I felt something inside me unclench, though I didn't yet know if it was relief or fear. At the shelter, the receptionist looked at me kindly. "He's been waiting for you," she said. And there he was, sitting on a worn couch, his backpack at his feet, eyes red but steady. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he stood, and I saw the boy I had raised and the man he was becoming, both in the same fragile frame. "Grandma," he said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a word heavy with everything that had come before. I reached out and touched his arm. "I'm here," I said. And for the first time in weeks, the words felt true. We drove home in silence, the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty, like a sealed jar that might shatter if shaken. The rain. I knew that if I spoke too soon, whatever fragile thread was connecting us might snap. He held the photograph I had brought with me, the old picture of the woman and the baby I'd bought in the thrift store, and I wondered if he thought it was us. Maybe it was easier to imagine strangers who'd gotten it right. When we finally reached the house, he hesitated at the door like someone entering a museum of their own life. Everything was the same. The clock that still didn't work, the faint smell of lemon polish, the chair he'd outgrown, but I never replaced. He walked slowly through the rooms, touching objects like evidence, each one asking him to remember who he had been here. I followed him quietly, not wanting to crowd him, not wanting to show how much I needed him to stay. That night, he slept in his old room, though he left the door half open. I lay awake listening to his breathing, faint but real, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was talking to ghosts. Yet beneath the relief, another feeling stirred, something heavier, more complicated. I knew this peace wouldn't last. The letter, his mother, the accusation, they still hovered above us, waiting to fall. At dawn, I rose and made breakfast, just as I used to. The smell of toast and coffee filled the kitchen. When he came in, he gave me a small, almost guilty smile. "You didn't have to," he said. I told him I didn't know how to stop. We ate quietly, the scrape of forks louder than our words. Then, after a long silence, he said, "She's gone." He said it without drama, as if reporting the weather, but I felt the air leave the room. "Gone where?" I asked, though I already knew. "She left the shelter last night," he said. "She didn't say where she was going, just left a note that said, 'Don't follow me this time.'" He tried to sound indifferent, but his voice trembled. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away gently. "She's not well," I said. "She never was," he answered, and the bitterness in his tone broke me. It was the first time he'd spoken of her without defending her, and I didn't know whether to be grateful or afraid. The next days passed like rehearsals for normal life. He helped me in the garden, fixed the old radio, even laughed once when the cat jumped onto his lap. But it was a fragile piece, full of pauses and half-finished sentences. I could feel the distance between us shifting, less hostile, but still cautious, like a wound that hasn't yet decided whether to scar or reopen. Sometimes he would catch me watching him and look away quickly, embarrassed by my hope. Other times, I caught him staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, part curiosity, part pity, part something older than his years. I knew he was trying to reconcile two versions of me, the woman who raised him and the woman who lied to keep him. I wanted to tell him that both were true. One afternoon, I found him in the attic, rummaging through boxes I hadn't opened in years. "I wanted to see pictures," he said, his voice calm, almost clinical. I let him. He spread the photos across the floor. Clara as a child, Clara pregnant, Clara holding him for the first time. He studied each one as though trying to decode a mystery. "She was beautiful," he said softly. "She still is," I replied before I could stop myself. He looked up at me then, his eyes sharp. "Do you still hate her?" The question landed between us like a stone. "I never hated her," I said. "I just ran out of ways to save her." He nodded, but his expression didn't soften. "She said you made her believe she was broken." I wanted to deny it, but instead I said, "Maybe I did. Maybe I thought that if she believed she was broken, she would let me hold the pieces." He looked down at the photographs again, and I knew he understood. But understanding is not forgiveness. That evening, we sat outside on the porch. The sunset was fierce, streaks of red bleeding into the horizon. He said, "I don't know what to think anymore." I told him he didn't have to. "You just have to live long enough to see the truth change shape," I said. He laughed quietly, not mockingly, just tired. Then, after a pause, he said, "She called me once before she left. She said she wanted to see you." My heart stopped. "Why?" I asked. "She said she needed to talk about something." "About the papers." The way he said it, "the papers," made my stomach twist. "What papers?" He hesitated. "The ones about me. About who really signed for custody." I felt cold then, colder than the sea air that crept in as the light faded. "I did," I said. "You know that." He shook his head slowly. "She said there was another signature. That you told the court she agreed to it, but she never did." For a moment I couldn't speak. My throat closed, my breath came short. I remembered that day, how the judge had asked if Clara consented, and how I had nodded even though she hadn't shown up. I told myself it was a formality, that it didn't matter because she was incapable of caring for him anyway. But hearing it now from his mouth, it sounded like theft. "She wasn't there," I said quietly. "She didn't come." "So you decided for her," he said, and it wasn't a question. The argument that followed wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was quiet and precise, like surgery. Every word he spoke was a scalpel. "You should have told me," he said. "You should have told me everything." I tried to explain that I was protecting him, that truth can be cruel to a child, but he was no longer a child. "You weren't protecting me," he said. "You were protecting yourself from losing me." I wanted to deny it, but I couldn't. He was right. Every act of love I had committed had been tangled with fear. I had built our life like a house without windows, thinking it would keep the storms out, never realizing it would also keep the light from getting in. He went to his room, and I sat in the kitchen, listening to the wind pick up again. The house seemed to breathe differently, as if even the walls were tired of my secrets. I thought of the tape, the voice saying she's already gone. Maybe she hadn't been gone after all. Maybe she had just been erased in the way people are erased when others speak louder. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the table with the court papers spread out in front of me, reading every line, every signature. The ink was faded, but the memory wasn't. I remembered the pen trembling in my hand, the weight of the silence after the judge stamped the final approval. I had thought it was the sound of safety. Now I understood it was the sound of something closing forever. At dawn, I walked outside barefoot, the grass wet with dew. The horizon was gray, the kind of color that promises neither rain nor light. I whispered to the sea, though I didn't know if I was asking for forgiveness or release. I did what I thought was right, I said. But maybe right and wrong are just words people use to feel less alone in their choices. The waves didn't answer. They just kept moving as they always had, erasing everything that touched them. When I went back inside, Leo was gone again. This time he left no note, no message, only the photo of Clara and him, the one from the shelter, pinned to my door with a single word written on the back. Truth. I sat on the floor holding that photo for a long time, my heart heavy, but strangely calm. I knew then that something had shifted irrevocably. Whatever came next would not be about explanations or defenses. It would be a reckoning. The truth had come for me, not in anger, but in inevitability, like the tide finally reaching the place where I'd been standing too long, pretending I wouldn't get wet. I didn't search for Leo right away. Not because I didn't want to find him, but because I knew that chasing him would only push him further away. Instead, I cleaned the house, not out of habit, but out of something closer to ritual, as though putting things in order could hold the pieces of my life together long enough for him to come back. I washed the curtains, swept the porch, polished the brass frame of the mirror in the hallway, the one that had belonged to my mother. When I looked into it, I barely recognized myself. My face had changed, not from age, but from the exhaustion of carrying love like a secret too heavy to tell. I realized that for years I had lived inside other people's silences, first Clara's, then Leo's, and that somewhere along the way I had mistaken endurance for strength. But love is not endurance. Love, when it hardens into control, becomes something else entirely. The letter, the photograph, the accusation, all of it had forced me to look at what I had done not as a series of sacrifices, but as a pattern of fear. I kept hearing Leo's voice saying, "You decided for her," and the words turned into a rhythm I couldn't escape. Every generation in my family had decided for someone else. My mother decided when I would marry. My husband decided when he would leave. And I decided when my daughter would lose her child. The pattern was too clean, too cruel. That afternoon, I went to the chest again, but this time I didn't take out the documents. I took out the pen I had used to sign those papers 16 years ago, the same pen that had turned Clara's absence into legality. It still worked, the ink dark and obedient. I held it in my hand and thought about how easily we give power to objects, how easily a single signature can turn love into ownership. By evening, I knew what I had to do. I called the county office and asked for the number of the caseworker who had handled the adoption. The woman who answered sounded surprised. She said most people didn't revisit cases that old. I told her I wasn't most people. Her name was Helen. A calm, precise voice that reminded me of someone who had spent a lifetime sorting through the wreckage of other families. I told her I wanted to amend the file, to include a statement that the custody had not been consensual, that my daughter had never signed away her rights. There was a long pause on the other end. "You understand what that means, Mrs. Hayworth?" she asked. "It could nullify your guardianship on record." I said yes. My voice didn't tremble. For the first time, I wasn't speaking out of fear. I was speaking out of exhaustion, the kind that comes when you've run from the truth for too many years and finally realize it's walking at your side, quietly waiting for acknowledgement. After I hung up, I sat at the table where it had all begun and wrote a letter, not to Clara, not to Leo, but to the state. I wrote that I had acted out of love, but that love had no right to decide who belongs to whom. I wrote that I wanted the record to show the truth, even if it came too late to matter. And when I signed my name at the bottom, it felt like an unbinding, a slow release of something that had been clenched for half my life. I didn't expect forgiveness. I didn't even expect anyone to read it. I just wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside my own body. That night, as I was sealing the envelope, I heard the gate creak open. My heart stuttered. For a moment, I thought it was only the wind, but then I saw a shadow move past the window. When the knock came, it was hesitant, polite. I opened the door, and there he was, Leo. He looked different again, older by months, perhaps years. His eyes were tired, but not angry. He was holding another envelope damp from the mist. "She's gone," he said, and the way he said it told me he didn't mean she'd simply left town. "I'm sorry," he added softly. I stepped aside, and he came in. We didn't hug. We just stood there, letting the silence speak first. He handed me the envelope. It was addressed to me, the handwriting shaky but familiar. Clara's. I opened it slowly, my fingers trembling over the folds. There were only a few lines, uneven, almost childlike. "Mom, I wanted to tell you that I tried. I wanted to fix it. But maybe I was never meant to be the kind of person who stays. Tell Leo I love him. Tell him you were right to keep him safe. But please don't let the truth die with me." The paper smelled faintly of smoke. I looked up at Leo, who was watching me with a strange calm. "She wrote it before it happened," he said, his voice breaking. "The police found it in her room." I wanted to speak, to comfort him, to say something wise, but the words wouldn't come. I just reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. We sat at the table together, the letter between us, the air thick with all the things we couldn't undo. For a long time, neither of us moved. Finally, he said, "She loved you, you know, even when she hated you." I nodded. "I know," I said. "That's the hardest kind of love." He looked at me then with a softness I hadn't seen since he was a boy. "She said you did what she couldn't. You stayed." I wanted to tell him that staying isn't always the brave choice, that sometimes it's just the one left to those who can't run anymore, but I didn't. I just squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back. When the night grew deep and the house went quiet, I burned the letter, not out of shame, but out of mercy. The smoke rose in thin gray ribbons, disappearing through the open window. I watched it drift toward the sea, carrying her words into the dark. Then I placed the ashes in the same tin box where I kept her childhood drawings, the ones full of wild colors and crooked hearts. For the first time, I felt that the past wasn't chasing me anymore. When it touched the table where the letter had been, it turned the wood pale and new-looking, as though even the house had decided to start again. I thought about what Clara had written, "Don't let the truth die with me," and realized that maybe the truth wasn't a single story or confession. Maybe it was this: two people sitting in a kitchen at dawn, still alive, still trying, still bound by love that had failed and survived at the same time. I didn't know what Leo would do next, whether he would stay or leave again, whether he would carry his mother's story or mine. But as I watched him sleeping, I knew that whatever version of me lived in his memory would finally be real. Not saint, not thief, not liar. Just a woman who loved too fiercely and learned too late that love is not ownership. It is the courage to let go. Morning came with the smell of rain and the sound of the tide crawling closer to the shore. The air had that washed, metallic stillness that comes after long storms, when even the gulls are quiet, as though the world itself has agreed to rest. Leo was still asleep on the couch, his arm hanging over the side, fingers curled loosely, the way he used to sleep as a child after long days at the beach. I stood in the doorway watching him and felt that strange mixture of peace and sorrow that comes when you realize something has ended without truly disappearing. I wanted to reach out and touch his hair, to feel the proof that he was real, but I didn't. Love doesn't need to prove itself anymore. It only needs to keep still and breathe. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the sea turn silver under the early light. The horizon looked clearer than it had in months, as if the world had wiped its eyes. The house felt different too. Lighter, maybe smaller, but no longer haunted. The letters, the papers, the old ghosts that had filled every corner seemed to have loosened their grip. I thought about Clara, about the letter I had burned, and the ashes now resting in the tin box beside her drawings. For the first time, I didn't think of her as an absence. I thought of her as part of the air, the light, the motion of the sea. Maybe the dead never truly leave. They just learn to live where words can't follow. When Leo woke, he joined me at the table without speaking. He poured himself coffee and drank it slowly, as though tasting adulthood for the first time. The silence between us was no longer sharp. It was companionable, filled with small understandings. After a while, he said he wanted to go back to school, maybe move to the city when he was ready. I nodded. I didn't ask when or how long. I told him I would help him pack if he needed. "You won't be angry if I go?" he asked, his voice quiet. "No," I said. "The only thing worse than losing someone is keeping them out of fear." He looked at me for a long moment, then smiled in that way of his that never quite reached his eyes, but was still full of tenderness. "You're different," he said. "Maybe," I replied. "Maybe I'm finally honest." In the afternoon, we walked down to the beach. The tide was low, the sand wet and glistening like glass. We didn't speak much. Sometimes words only interfere with the truth. He found a small piece of driftwood shaped like a heart and handed it to me. "Keep this," he said, "for luck." I laughed softly. "I think I've used up all my luck." "Then keep it for memory," he said. I slipped it into my pocket. We stood there a while, watching the waves fold over themselves. When he turned to go, he hugged me, awkward, brief, but enough. I watched him walk up the path until he was just a shape against the light, then gone. The wind picked up and carried the sound of his footsteps away. That evening, I sat at the same kitchen table where everything had begun. The lies, the love, the letters. The chair across from me was empty, but it no longer felt accusing. I opened my notebook and began to write, not about what had happened, but about what it meant. I wrote that truth is not a weapon or a wound, but a mirror that finally stops fogging when you stop lying to yourself. I wrote that mothers and daughters are bound not by blood, but by unfinished apologies. And I wrote that forgiveness, when it comes, is not a single moment, but a quiet decision made again and again, every time you look at the past and choose not to flinch. When the light began to fade, I stepped outside. The tree Leo and I had planted years ago, the small one that had barely survived its first winter, was taller now, its branches trembling in the breeze. I reached out and touched the bark. It was rough and solid under my palm, alive in a way that nothing else in this house would ever be again. I whispered to it, the way old women do when no one is around. Grow well. Outlast us. The wind rustled through the leaves as if answering, and for a moment I thought I heard Clara's voice carried in it. Soft, almost laughing, saying, "Thank you for raising him." Maybe it was just the sea. Maybe it was her. It didn't matter anymore. Later, when I went back inside, I noticed that the clock in the hallway had started ticking again. I hadn't touched it in months, but the second hand moved with a steady rhythm. Quiet, but undeniable. I stood there listening to it, letting its small, stubborn pulse fill the house. Time was moving forward, whether I was ready or not. I smiled, a real one this time, the kind that comes not from joy, but from acceptance. I turned off the lights, opened the window to the sound of the waves, and whispered into the dark, "We're all right now." And for the first time in years, I believed it.